I wanted to just start really by saying, the bad news is that the maritime sector is a sector with very substantial human rights risks throughout its supply chain, although very differently distributed across that supply chain, and that we receive as the Resource Centre regular allegations of abuse regarding the various aspects of the maritime sector. The good news, however, is that there's also real leaders in the maritime sector that have been making significant efforts in terms of business and human rights. And there are, of course, a huge amount to learn from them, from those good companies of goodwill that want to make a significant change over the next period. There's also a huge amount to learn from other sectors that have taken this agenda of business and human rights and gone much further with it over the last perhaps 5 years. But it's also worth noting that there is new regulation coming in. There's new efforts at mandatory transparency, the Modern Slavery Act being one of them, the UK Modern Slavery Act, and there's also efforts to make sure that there's incentives coming in to make businesses move towards really respecting human rights throughout their supply chains.
Sorry, they've gotten your slides up now, so if you want to,
Yeah, I don't have slides.
Okay.
I don't have slides.
Excuse me, Brandon.
Yeah, no trouble at all. So the people at the back can relax.
Yeah.
Now, while some industry sectors, with high risks in their human rights abuse, high risks of human rights abuse, have been grappling with human rights impacts for years, the maritime sector has been largely absent from this debate and from much of the action. But the sector does face urgent human rights abuses, and it is rapidly becoming a sector where there is greater public scrutiny, as many of you will know, perhaps with some pain. From the modern slavery, but the fact is that scrutiny is coming in to various sectors of the maritime industry, from modern-day slavery in the fishing industry, to working conditions in shipbreaking yards, to the protection of human rights defenders throughout the industry, to environmental contamination and issues of human health. So the industry really needs to move and make clear action now around norms and around action to remove these really high levels of risks of abuse. At the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, we essentially track about the human rights performance of about 6,500 companies around the world, including many from the maritime sector. If you want to go on our site, you'll find lots of resources in terms of, first of all, the track record of the companies, your peers and competitors, perhaps yourselves as well as the opportunities, the issues that have been, the attitudes and the changes that have been made in other sectors that relate directly and are relevant to the maritime sector as well. So I'll start with perhaps a quick note on the issue of trafficking and modern slavery in fisheries in particular. So the issue of forced labour, human trafficking, modern slavery is in every supply chain in the world. There's nowhere that it is absent. The maritime industry is one of the places where it's at its highest risk. And therefore, this brutal trade in human beings and in the ownership of human beings is one that the maritime sector really does have to take fully into account. There really is no excuse anymore for not being able to demonstrate full due diligence in terms of removing and seeking to eliminate human rights risks from your sector. There are already companies that are well ahead of most of the maritime industries. They are companies that are already ensuring, first of all, that they identify, that they do real due diligence in terms of identifying where in their supply chain are the hotspots for real risk in modern slavery, doing deep dives of research into just those particular areas, not the whole of the supply chain, wasting billions of dollars, but then being able to make sure that they really collaborate with the workers' organisations, with civil society, and with their competitors who use that same supply chain to eliminate those kinds of risks. It is not, for instance, doing what many companies currently do, which is a nice little inspection audit once every 6 months with at least 6 weeks of notice given to the company that's going to be inspected. That will not work. So that's the way in which the maritime industry can really learn from the other industries. There's also the case that the Institute has been working with other companies on the issue of recruitment and human trafficking. And they've come up with a very simple formula, which is the company pays for the recruitment. There should be no fees at all. And they've got the likes of Coca-Cola and Unilever and many of the largest industries to sign up to that. We'll come on to recruitment in a minute. The other thing to say is that, of course, as I mentioned, there is a shift, particularly on modern slavery, towards the removal by governments. The mandatory transparency in the UK Modern Slavery Act, but we've now got Obama's move towards the Trade Facilitation Act, closing loopholes there, which means that any products coming into the United States where there is a reasonable risk that they've been produced by slavery can be impounded until the company can demonstrate that those goods have not been produced by modern slavery. So the burden of proof has shifted radically there, and it's sending quite significant shockwaves in terms of importers. So I'll just give you a couple of cases in terms of modern slavery. In October 2008, a number of plaintiffs took a case of class action in the United States regarding 500 Indian workers. They said that they'd been trafficked into the United States by Signal International and by a set of recruitment companies. They said they'd been charged $20,000 each, with the promise that they would get work permits and residency in the United States. They were then held in basically guarded compounds. This was for a marine repair company. They were held in guarded compounds. The claims were around trafficking, fraud, racketeering, and discrimination. To cut a long story short, by July 2015, just 16 of those 500 workers had had their cases seen, and to the cost of $20 million to the company and to the recruitment companies. The company of Signal International has, of course, filed for bankruptcy because of that. Another case that's particularly relevant at the moment is Costco lawsuit on modern slavery in Thailand. The plaintiff took a case in California, basically saying that they had bought products which had slavery in the supply chain, basically because of the Thai fisheries, taking fish that was converted to fish meal, fed to the prawns that were then sold in California. And that case has been dismissed but only because the plaintiff could not fully demonstrate that the fish meal that was fed to the prawns had come directly from slave labour from the Thai fishing industry. What's interesting there also is that Nestlé had a similar case taken against it. The case was dismissed precisely because Nestlé could demonstrate that it had due diligence in its supply chain regarding the elimination of slavery. That meant that it had that protection. So coming out with a scale of being transparent about the scale of due diligence which Nestlé had brought in gave them a lot of legal protection, which is worth consideration. Another area is poor working conditions and living wage, the freedom of association. This is perhaps particularly in shipbreaking yards. In shipbreaking yards, these in many ways exemplify the problem of low wage, of poverty wages, of abusive working conditions. This is about the disposal chain of the maritime industry. How do ships get broken up? And unfortunately, the situation, as we know, there's, according to union and NGO estimates, hundreds of shipbreaking workers are killed every year in South Asia, in Bangladesh, Pakistan and India. That includes children. The families of victims are rarely compensated for these losses. According to Industrial, and I'm quoting here, the Gadana yard in Pakistan is the world's third largest, employing an average of 15,000 workers. Workers normally work 7 days a week, often at least 12 hours a day, with no paid holidays, no benefits, and salaries of around $113 per month, equal to half the living wage. Those kind of conditions cannot be acceptable. And in the coming few years, as many of you will know much better than I, there is a whole generation of cruise ships that are coming to the end of their life and due to be broken up. This must be an opportunity to shift, through the action of the cruise ship owners, to shift those working conditions in those shipbreaking yards. But of course, if a key way to stop abuse in your supply chains is to involve workers and workers' organisations in this effort. Because to be frank, workers know much better than managers where the abuse is, and they also know who are the abusers. And equally, if you want to ensure that, if you want to encourage abuse in your supply chain, which is also closely linked to corruption, where bad companies can thrive and good companies will wither, then repression of workers and their organisations and the silencing of those workers is the effective tactic to use. I mention this because, for instance, the shipbreaking yards, in March this year, 7 people were hit by bullets, allegedly by security guards in the Kabir shipbreaking yard. Now, Kabir Shipbreaking wrote back to us when we took this incident up with them, denying any wrongdoing on their part, despite the guards being employed by them. Standard Charter, again, said the similar. Standard Charter, who were the major investors with the shipbreaking yard, effectively gave a cursory statement, and you can compare that to other investors that are starting to really take this issue very much more seriously. KLP in Norway are now committed to a much more radical approach. KLP, the CEO said KLP hopes to encourage investors to work together to engage with companies on improving labour and environmental conditions in these yards. ABN and AMRO is an active member of the Sustainable Shipping Initiative and recognise the importance of finance in facilitating the shipping industry's sustainability drive. We, as both the Institute and the Resource Centre, are pushing hard in terms of trying to get investors to really start to take these human rights issues in the industry seriously. And there's a lot of the major investors are prepared to start shifting on this and make sure that capital is much more available to those companies that take the human rights risks in their supply chain more seriously. So I want to just finish really by saying there are leaders in your sector, and there are, but broadly, the maritime industries is essentially a laggard in terms of the business and human rights sector, and that has to change and it has to catch up. It will become a bigger target for public scrutiny from campaigning bodies, not ourselves. There's a great deal of good companies around from which to learn, and to learn very quickly from across, both within the sector and across the sector. And also, I would ask people to be alert to the significant shift in government behaviour towards much more mandatory due diligence and transparency in the supply chains than has previously been the case, but also this issue of public procurement being used to make sure that there are real incentives for the companies to adopt much more responsible behaviour regarding human rights. And I think I'll finish there. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bill.